Well, thanks everybody for coming today. As Kim said, I'm going to be talking about my capstone project from this summer on assessing the ecological integrity of wetlands in Rocky Mountain National Park. Just to give a brief overview of what I'm going to be talking about today, I wanted to go through a couple of acknowledgements and then talk about the purpose and goals of my project from this summer, give a summary of the information that I was reviewing throughout this process, and then go through kind of my intro, methods, results, and discussion. Give some present some recommendations that I gave through my product, give some concluding remarks on this project, and then shift gears real quickly to talk about another project that I'd worked on a little bit this summer, or actually a lot this summer, and then just give some final reflections on the capstone and CLTL process. So first, just wanted to acknowledge a few people who really helped me out through this process. Rocky Mountain National Park staff. Rocky was my partner this summer. Hannah Mavlez is my boss at the park, and she's coming, I think, at some point today. But she was also my primary contact for this project, and she really helped me out a lot, put a lot of work and time into this. So thanks to Hannah. Also the Research Learning Center at Rocky, who provided some funding for me to be able to do this project. CSU advisors, Kim, of course, my primary advisor, and she provided a lot of insight and help to me throughout this summer on this project. And then Tara, thanks a lot, Tara, and Greg is coming in as well. They're my other committee members, and yeah, thanks for putting the time in to help me out on this project. And then, of course, just the CLTL team obviously wouldn't have had this experience without this program. So just wanted to kind of break down the purpose and goals of this project to start. Basically, my main objective for my capstone was to create a research brief for Rocky Mountain National Park resource stewardship staff to be able to use to assess the wetland condition of these wetland habitats in the park. My goal is to create the most accurate, concise, and relevant product that I could. Didn't want to produce some big, long document that sat on the shelf and collected dust. It wasn't ever looked at. I really wanted to sort of compile the best information that I could that could be utilized for management decisions in the park.
I just started.
Okay.
My library.
Sorry, buddy.
That's okay.
Class.
And one of the main pieces of input that I received from the park before starting this project was that they wanted me to create a product that had a variety of options they could utilize when determining how they were going to monitor their wetland systems. So they wanted a sort of scalable approach to wetland monitoring in regards to funding that changes from year to year. Personnel and funding resources can go up and down from year to year. So they wanted to be able to use this document to sort of respond to those changes and be able to still continue their monitoring processes over the years. Another goal that sort of surfaced throughout this process for me was that I really didn't want to reinvent the wheel. So I originally was going to try and compile a monitoring process from the ground up, but I realized that a lot of people with a lot more experience than me have worked on this topic for a long time. So my goal is to sort of utilize resources that are out there the best that I could to compile something that was very relevant and useful for the park. And then, of course, I wanted to be able to apply skills that I've learned through my CLTL courses. So just to give a brief summary of the information that I kind of compiled this summer, wetlands are very important ecosystems to both humans and wildlife alike. Wetlands are under great stress from a variety of threats worldwide. Protected areas are a really important resource for conserving wetlands in the face of these threats. There are a lot of different approaches that you can utilize to assess the condition of wetlands over time, and then also bringing in the concept of citizen science and volunteering, how that can be a very effective resource to utilize when conducting biological monitoring. All right, so just a little bit more background on wetlands. So even though they only cover about 6% of the world's surface, they're one of the most productive ecosystems on Earth. They provide a lot of different ecosystem services to humans. They filter and maintain water supplies, they provide coastal storm protection, they facilitate habitat for the harvesting of various food sources, rice and shellfish and other sources of food around the world. And also there are a lot of recreational and cultural benefits that come from these ecosystems when they're intact. As well as ecosystem services provided to humans, they also play a key role in the life cycles of a lot of species of wildlife and plants. Almost half of the species almost half of the endangered species in the U.S. rely on wetland habitat for part of their life cycle, so they're really important for a lot of species. And even though these systems are so important, they are under threat from a lot of different sources of stressors and degradation, from pollution, agricultural development, fragmentation. All of these different stressors influence the integrity of these systems. So protected areas are really important in the face of all these threats on these systems. And so one of the most well-known protected areas in this region is Rocky Mountain National Park, which was my partner organization this summer. So Rocky contains nearly 16 square miles of wetlands, which is about 4% of the park's total area. And the wetlands in Rocky provide habitat for 65% of the park's rare plant species, 45% of their birds, and 20% of their mammals. So they're very important within this protected area. But like all other wetlands in the world, they're subject to threats and stressors. So I'm going to just sort of break down some of those threats and also some of the major components of the ecosystems within Rocky Mountain National Park. So land use in Rocky and the entire park, but also wetland specific. Land use between the mid-1800s and mid-1900s included a lot of resource harvesting, development, and of course tourism. So those influenced and impacted the integrity of these systems. And then a few other natural components of the system that really have an influence on the integrity. Elk are a big part of this system. They are native to this area and they were considered abundant until about the late 1800s. And then they were extirpated in the area due to hunting pressures, were later reintroduced from a stock in Yellowstone in the early 1900s and have been subject to a variety of different management regimes since then. So that they have a big influence on the ecosystem there. Another big part of the ecosystem is the predators, or used to be anyway. There aren't any grizzly bears or wolves present in this system anymore. They were eliminated in about the early 1900s. And then beaver are another big influence on this system. They're ecosystem engineers, and they really changed different components of wetland systems. They are still present in the park in small numbers, but there used to be, if you've been to Moraine Park, there used to be 300 beavers in Moraine Park, and now there might be a couple. So they're not playing that ecological role that they used to. And then fire I'm not really going to go into, but of course that's another big influence on ecosystems, wetland ecosystems throughout the West. So just to break these components down a little bit further, I wanted to kind of paint a picture of what the ideal natural ecosystem of Rocky Mountain National Park wetlands would be if everything was in perfect proportion and all of these components were present. So ideally we would have our top predators, which would influence the ungulate populations in the park, elk specifically for this context. The elk have an impact on the willow and aspen and other vegetation in the park. Beaver also have that big impact, like I said, they're ecosystem engineers. So they produce beaver dams, which raises the water table, which has an effect on how willow and aspen can grow. Willows specifically like to have their feet wet in order to grow well. So if beaver are present, they elevate the water table and facilitates the growth of willows. And if you have a healthy vegetative ecosystem, then your biodiversity is going to increase because habitat is present for a lot of different species. So that's not the case in Rocky Mountain National Park. We wish it was, but there are definitely some differences between ideal and real reality for this system. So we don't have our top predators anymore. So therefore elk have virtually no influence on their population, no control. So their populations explode, which means that they're eating a lot more, which means that the vegetation is obviously going to take a nosedive. And therefore habitat's not present and biodiversity is going to increase. Then we do have a couple beaver still in our system, but not nearly in the amount ponds that they used to be naturally. So beaver dams aren't really being built, which means the water table is lower than it would be if beavers were present. And that's kind of a double hit on the vegetation. Willow and aspen are reduced due to the fact that the water table is lower. And so biodiversity is also decreased twofold. So in the context of the state of these ecosystems in Rocky Mountain National Park, I wanted to present to you the mission statement of the National Park Service. So the National Park Service preserves unimpaired the natural and cultural resources and values of the national park system for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of this and future generations. And so with this mission in mind, Rocky Mountain National Park is sort of responding to the state of these ecosystems through the elk and vegetation management plan. This is the crew that I work on in the summertime, as does Nick over there. Basically, what we do is we manage the relationship between elk and wetlands in Rocky Mountain National Park. We monitor vegetation as well as ungulate populations. We look at how browse is affecting the willow and the aspen. We also monitor how elk and moose are moving throughout the park, how many there are, what kinds of habitats they're using seasonally. So this is sort of where my capstone project comes into play. My goal for this summer was to conduct a review of information regarding different ways to assess wetland condition. Basically, to see how these management actions that the elk and vegetation management plan are carrying out and how they're affecting these systems. So just to go through my methods, basically in my review, I reviewed a bunch of relevant literature, I conducted some interviews, and I also did a little bit of field work. For my review of literature, I sort of just did this really broad scale assessment of just literature in various categories, federal and state level government documents, peer-reviewed literature, documents from private and nonprofit organizations, anything that would come up on the topic of wetland assessment, integrity assessment in that category. I looked at over 100 documents and sort of just compiled the information that I found. I also conducted 7 phone interviews with a variety of experts and professionals in the field of wetland management. I found these interviewees basically by word of mouth. I'd speak to one person and they'd say, oh, this is a great person you should talk to. So I would email them, give them kind of a backstory on my project, give them a couple questions maybe, and we would just have a conversation about this topic. And my goal for these interviews was to gain as much specific contextual information that I could on this topic specific to Rocky Mountain National Park wetlands. And then I recorded and transcribed the interviews in order to maintain accuracy as much as possible. I didn't really do much field work, but I did get out in the field for a couple of days with one crew through the inventory and monitoring program through National Park Service. They have a program called the Wetland Ecological Integrity Monitoring Program, which I'm going to talk about more in detail. But basically I read their hundreds and hundreds of pages of protocols and narratives, and I wanted to get out in the field and see what they were actually doing. So that was my little bit of field work for this project. Going into my results. So basically I found that through interviews and reviewing all the literature, there are a lot of different ways that you can assess condition and integrity of wetlands. It's a really complex type of system, and so it's really difficult to choose the right kinds of indicators. It has to be very context specific, site specific, and so there are a lot of different ways you can kind of go about figuring out the best way to measure these systems. There were a few major themes that surfaced throughout my review that I wanted to touch on in this presentation. As I said, I reviewed over 100 documents, and I didn't do an annotated bibliography on all of them or anything, but I picked out the ones that I felt were very relevant to the system. But yeah, I wanted to touch on a couple of themes first. So the first one that came up a lot was that of baseline data and reference condition. Basically, almost every reference that I looked at stated that understanding historical baseline conditions is imperative when you're trying to define reference conditions and trying to establish a new monitoring program. So if you don't have a really clear picture of what you're trying to achieve, it's really hard to move along that trajectory of achieving goals. So setting management objectives with well-defined framework is really important, and just knowing what it is that you're working towards. So monitoring programs should include both descriptive and experimental components. Descriptive being that really specific natural ecosystem state, including natural fluctuations that would happen in the system. And then your experimental components are your management actions and just keeping track of those actions and how they're affecting your system. One good example of baseline data that was established in this area was through the Rocky Mountain National Park vegetation classification and mapping project, which was completed in 2005 in the park. And basically they were trying to provide core baseline data to managers in order to effectively manage these ecosystems within the park. They were aiming to understand what kind of rare and common species are present in the park. So of course that overlaps with wetlands. And this was a very collaborative process. There were a lot of different organizations involved. There were other federal agencies as well as private partners such as the Nature Conservancy and Colorado Natural Heritage Program. So that collaborative theme is going to come up a lot in the more well-rounded product you're going to end up with. So my next theme that I wanted to talk about was scale and connectivity. That came up a lot also in my review. So basically the idea that large-scale indicator suites are likely to be more reliable than monitoring individual species was something that came up pretty frequently. A lot of the earlier studies of wetland systems would look at one species or a couple different ones and not really associate them with each other. And that kind of keeps you from painting a really full, complete picture of the system. So if you're measuring ecological integrity and ecosystem condition, rather than solely looking at biodiversity, that can typically give you a better idea of how the whole system is functioning together. Keeping that in mind, I also did break out some of the specific indicators that came up throughout this process. I made a giant table. I didn't want to put it on the presentation because it's kind of an eyesore. But I kind of broke out the main components of it. Basically, this was in response to the park's request for a scalable approach to assessing these systems. So I pulled out some of the most common indicators and metrics that came up in the literature and sort of broke them out on a scale of pros, cons, costs, required expertise, and temporal restrictions that typically come along with monitoring these kinds of indicators. So I was hoping that this might be a quick reference that the park could look at and just get an idea of what might go into monitoring these different types of indicators. So now I wanted to go into breaking down a few of the specific methodologies that I came across that I thought were very specifically relevant to the park. The EPA ThreeTier Framework, the EPA Methods for Evaluating Wetland Condition, the Ecological Integrity Assessment for Colorado Wetlands, and the Wetland Ecological Integrity Monitoring Program, which is the one that I mentioned before that I went out and did field work on. So first off, the EPA ThreeTier Framework. Basically, this framework is being used by a lot of different states to develop different wetland assessment protocols. And so this is a really nice flexible tool that can be used for assessment and monitoring and can be adjusted based on the availability of resources, again, touching back on that scalable approach. And this EPA three-tiered framework is broken down into 3 hierarchical levels of assessment, starting at a broad scale and working down to very specific style of assessment. So the first highest level is called a landscape assessment, and basically this relies on sort of coarse filter data collection. It's usually done through remote sensing and stored in a GIS format, so it's a good way to try and assess a large landscape scale, but it's not really providing a lot of detail. The next level is called the rapid assessment, and this is the one that's really being used on a state level pretty broadly in different places. It's typically quick and simple protocols, but it's down on the ground level of wetland site, and it's more specific, of course, than your level 1, but it can also be fleshed out more by utilizing the third tier within this system, which is the intensive site assessment. This is typically research-based. It's usually uses multi-metric indices, and it's very specific style, detailed data that's being collected. So you typically need someone who is a specialist, whether it's a botanist or just someone specializing in whatever kind of data collection you're doing, to collect this kind of data. So they sort of all work together, but different levels can be utilized in the face of different levels of resources being available. And we have the EPA methods for evaluating wetland condition. Basically, this is a series of reports that aims to assist in the development of wetland condition methods. There are 20 modules within this series, and each of them addresses a different component of wetland condition assessment, beginning at just the general idea of how to create a protocol, and then moving on into specific metrics such as invertebrates, birds, fish, and then they also touch on different topics such as utilizing volunteer efforts in biomonitoring and just anything you could think of that might come up in a monitoring protocol. They have a module for that. And then I'm going to go into the volunteer efforts in biomonitoring a little bit further later. And then we have the Ecological Integrity Assessment for Colorado Wetlands. This was developed by Colorado Natural Heritage Program. And basically, this is a multi-metric approach aiming to measure overall condition of wetlands. This protocol has typically been used in the past to assess broad-scale river basin condition, but it can be applied in a variety of landscape contexts, and the creators of this protocol encourage that as well. Results, they aim to analyze results in order to be used in a very on-the-ground sort of management, informing management and conservation goals, so really being able to utilize the results on the ground. And this is also based on a three-tiered hierarchical structure. It's originally based off of that EPA framework that I mentioned before, but they have their own specific breakdown, same idea from broad scale to more specific. Their highest level is called a rank factor, which is basically broken down into landscape condition and size of the area that you're looking at. That is further broken down into major ecological factors, which looks at a more specific level of vegetation, hydrology, physiochemistry, and then those major ecological factors are broken further down into metrics, more specific, such as soil condition, natural land cover, exotics, that kind of thing. And then finally, the last methodology I wanted to break down was that of the Wetland Ecological Integrity Monitoring Program. So this is a National Park Service program, and it's actually being carried out in Rocky Mountain National Park currently. So basically, this program was established to look at status, trends, and causes of change in wetland conditions specific to Rocky Mountain National Park. Their major components that they're looking at are hydrology, soils, and vegetation. They're also taking human and natural disturbance impacts into account. And again, this data is interpreted in a way that's very relevant to partners, and they aim to be able to apply it in a very on-the-ground way where management can, apply these results to their monitoring programs. So my final component of results that I wanted to mention, citizen science was sort of another component of this project that I was looking into, sort of along the lines of that scalable approach that I mentioned. In the face of fluctuating resources, you might have fewer personnel one year. So being able to utilize volunteer efforts was something that the park wanted me to look into as well. So there's definitely a growing sector of the public that is concerned with natural area degradation, especially in this region. If you've been up to Rocky Mountain National Park, you know that Estes Park is very involved and interested in being a part of conserving their public lands. So there's definitely an interest in this area, and there are a lot of volunteers already participating in monitoring the park. But basically, citizen scientists can contribute greatly to these monitoring efforts, and it's also a really good opportunity to build capacity and strengthen local stewardship. You've got the people in the community who want to be a part of taking care of these systems, and they're willing to do it for free, so it's a good opportunity to take advantage of. There have been studies comparing the quality of volunteer data to that of professionally collected data, and depending on the scale that you're trying to monitor, if you're on one of those really specific protocols, like I talked about, where you're trying to collect very specific data, it's impossible to get away from the fact that you're going to need professionals at some point to collect, your baseline data. But a lot of monitoring protocols will have, less complex portions where volunteers can definitely contribute. So there are those shortcomings you have to consider, such as data quality, as well as time and effort that needs to go into supervising and training these people, as well as safety and liability issues, which is a big one that the Park Service considers. But a lot of these shortcomings they're outweighed by the benefits that are gained from utilizing these resources. And I wanted to give an example of a really interesting citizen science program that's occurring right now in the local area. So Fort Collins Nature in the City has a biodiversity project. Basically, the objective of this project is to collect information on how to understand how land use is affecting wildlife, specifically birds and butterflies in the area. I really liked this protocol because they sort of addressed some of those issues that come up with utilizing citizen science efforts. Basically, they established their baseline at the very beginning of their project by hiring professionals to conduct surveys on these areas that they were interested in looking at. They looked at habitat and they looked at presence, absence of species, and so then the managers of this project could take that information and build their monitoring protocol off of that. So now they utilize volunteer efforts to collect sample data from both public and private lands. When volunteers come into the program, their level of expertise is determined, and then they are trained accordingly in both classroom and field settings. And then they carry out these collection sample surveys throughout the summer, throughout the season. And then one other thing that I really liked about this protocol was at the end of the season, they hold a recognition event to thank the volunteers for their efforts, which I think is really important when it comes to retaining volunteers and maintaining the resources that it takes to recruit new volunteers. So the volunteers can understand what kind of projects this data is going into that they've collected, and just to thank them for time and effort they put in. Okay, so I just wanted to go into a brief discussion of these specific protocols that I talked about and kind of tie them back specifically to the park and why I think they could be relevant to managers who are trying to develop a wetland monitoring system. So starting with that EPA ThreeTier Framework that I talked about, this is definitely a very effective starting point for developing monitoring programs. You've got that scalable approach that you can utilize in the face of fluctuating resources, and it's just a really good standardized approach to kind of start off with. Then we have the EPA methods for evaluating wetland condition. That was that 20-module report series that has information on just lots of different specifics that come up throughout that process of developing a monitoring program. It's a great standardized resource to refer back to. The EIA for Colorado wetlands. These protocols are specific to Colorado wetlands, so that's of course what we're going for here. They also have a lot of interesting analytical tools that kind of go along with their program. They use a floristic quality assessment calculator, which is basically a tool that rates the conservatism of plant species. Conservatism is defined as the probability that a plant will occur in an unaltered landscape. So using this calculator can help to assist in the assessment of biological and abiotic processes within a system, and then it also provides good information regarding a site's ecological integrity. There are also some spreadsheets associated with this protocol that you can go out in the field and collect your data and then plug it into this really nice, neat spreadsheet, and it gives you a rating based on comparing it to a pristine ecosystem, a pristine wetland that is comparative to the one that you're assessing. So these are kind of some nice broad scale analysis tools that can be utilized. And then we have the INM protocol, which I talked about, that was specifically developed for Rocky Mountain National Park. This is obviously very relevant context-wise because they are looking at the same kinds of things that the Elk and Vegetation Management Plan are interested in. They're currently carrying out these protocols year after year, so they have some good baseline data already. And the park does have a relationship with the INM network. So that's a really good place to kind of start when talking about developing a protocol specific for EVNP at Rocky. And then just the Nature and City Biodiversity Project. It's a really great simple volunteer data collection protocol, but it's built on reliable data that has a lot of integrity because it was collected by professionals in the field. So I think all of these different protocols could be helpful in the development of a monitoring program at Rocky. So just wanted to give a few recommendations based on this information that I compiled. Basically going back to the idea of not reinventing the wheel just kind of really stood out to me throughout this process. There are a lot of different protocols out there that are relevant and that have been, tried over years, and people have worked out the kinks. And I think there's a lot to be said for utilizing those resources. So specifically for this context, utilizing the structure of the I&M Wetland Ecological Integrity monitoring program, I think, is a really good place to start. And of course, the park did know this was happening. I think that one of my main roles was to sort of bring different groups together and make those connections a little more strongly than they already were in existence. So I think that working with this I&M program would be a really good place to start for the park. Communicating with the staff further on potentially sharing data. Like I said, there's a lot of really good baseline data that's already been collected through this program, so it's very relevant to the sites that EVNP is interested in monitoring. If the park wanted to take a step further, they could consider replicating WEI plots in other EVNP core study areas. So some of these wetland ecological integrity plots are already in existence in the core areas that EVNP is studying, and their plots are actually the same size as the ones that EVNP has for their vegetation monitoring program. So I think it could be a really easy way to kind of overlap those different protocols. In addition to the wetland ecological integrity program, if the park wanted to integrate any other indicators, I think that utilizing bird data could be a helpful one to add in. WEI looks at vegetation, hydrology, and soils. And as I said, the more indicators you're looking at, the more complete idea you'll have of the system, how the system is functioning. So looking at breeding bird data could be a good way to bring another indicator in. There are already survey protocols happening in the area in the park and around the park through Christmas bird counts, as well as summer solstice counts. So I think compiling that information in a useful way that's relevant to the park could be a good way to kind of maximize resources. Also, if they wanted to go further with it, they could establish their own monitoring program, potentially utilizing the biodiversity, the Nature in the City Fort Collins protocol as a baseline, potentially collecting, hardcore scientific data to start with, and then building off of that with your volunteer program. And then on the same vein, utilizing citizen science for different aspects of data collection. Of course, you can't utilize volunteers for everything, but they can definitely help to fill in the gaps. And then just a couple of concluding remarks on this project. So again, wetlands are a very important ecosystem to both humans and wildlife, and they should be conserved in the face of resource degradation. Main things for Rocky Mountain National Park staff to consider: utilizing structures of pre-existing monitoring programs, as well as increasing communication with experienced partners. And just the idea that collaborative conservation efforts are often very effective ways to best utilize expertise while preserving limited time and resources. So whether that means using volunteers or talking to your neighbors who've been doing these kinds of surveys for generations or for decades, however long they've been doing it, it's a great way to sort of maximize your resources. So kind of wrapping up that portion of my summer, I wanted to just speak briefly about another project that I spent some of my time on through CLTL. Basically, this project came up as a opportunity through one of our courses in the spring for our leadership class. Me and two other students were given the opportunity to compile policy briefs regarding fee changes in protected marine areas in the Caribbean. So this is a totally different topic from what I was just talking about. but this took up a lot of my time this summer, so I did want to mention it. Basically, we were able to conduct a review of literature, sort of similar to my capstone, but basically we compiled as much information as we could on fee changes in protected areas, specifically to the context of St. Vincent and the Grenadines and Grenada. And we were actually given the chance to go down to these countries for a week to present our findings. We presented 3 different stakeholder groups. Those groups included government employees as well as private business owners in the fields of diving, as well as cruise ships and yachts. So we basically presented the information that we found in the literature, and they were able to give us feedback on the more contextually specific details about this topic. They've been talking about changing fees in these countries for a decade, and it hasn't happened yet, so it's a very complicated system. And so we're currently still working on putting together our final copies of these briefs, and we'll pass them down to our partner, Sustainable Grenadines, which is an NGO down in the Caribbean, and they'll pass them on to the government, and hopefully these documents will help to make these policy changes. So just wanted to mention that real quickly. Yeah, and so finally I just wanted to present some of my reflections on the CLTO process, as well as specific to my capstone. I think this process gave me a good opportunity to learn some more about real-world time management and planning. I'm a very organized person, and back in February I had this whole Gantt chart planned out of how my process was going to go, and then my project changed entirely, so had to sort of adaptively manage on that one, which is a topic we talk a lot about in CLTL. I also learned that I really liked having autonomy over this project, but also I really enjoyed the collaborative portion of this too. I think the interviews were my favorite part. It was really interesting to just talk to these people who had been working on these systems for decades, and they knew what they were talking about, and they were able to give me this really interesting, very context-specific information, and helped me to sort of fill in the gaps that the literature left regarding the specific systems in rock heap. Also, I really enjoyed sort of compiling and synthesizing this information from all these different sources into a very concise document. I think it's really important to utilize those resources that are out there and not reinvent the wheel yet again in order to come up with a usable product. And then sort of just regarding CLTL in general, conservation will always be a science-centric field based on my personal interests. I have a more biological, technical background compared to some of the other students in our cohort who had a lot of social science experience. But that being said, after going through this process, I definitely feel like I have a better perspective on how multifaceted conservation really is, and how you have to consider different components of the system, whether it's development or marketing or economics or equity, all these different things. I'll always consider it to be a science-centric field, but I think definitely having those different perspectives has helped me become a more well-rounded person, and hopefully well-rounded professional in the future. And just considering human dimensions as a part of every system, whether you're working within the boundary lines of a national park or internationally in a small community, human dimensions are going to be a part of conservation no matter where you go. So thank you for your time, and I would welcome any comments or questions.